If you have been to the Illinois Holocaust Museum, you will have seen artifacts, videos, reading materials, photos, and documents that attest to the fact that indeed there was a Holocaust. When you leave the museum, you would be able to refute and repudiate anyone who tries to deny that a Holocaust occurred. 6 million Jews were murdered. That's a huge number and hard to imagine. I'm going to tell you about just one family that was in the Holocaust, my family. My name is Faye Levinson, but when I was born in 1947, I was named Feigebeile Grunbart. My mother was Perla Blas Grunbart and my father was Gershon Grunbart. They were both Holocaust survivors. My father was born in 1918 in the city of Lodz, Poland. He was the son of Bela Rachel Schach and Yehuda Leibish Grunbart. He had 2 sisters, Zisa and Hannah Friedel. Next. I never knew how my father obtained these photos. My mother was born in 1925 in the city of Warsaw, Poland, but her family moved to Lodz when she was an infant. She was the daughter of Feiga and Ziesman Blas. She had 6 sisters, Sarah, Rivka Esther, Yocheved Gittel, Miriam Zlata, Blima Reitza, and Leah. Except for my mother and father, none of those people survived the Holocaust. It is a Jewish custom to name a child after a deceased relative to perpetuate the name. My name is a combination of the names of my grandmothers. Lodz was an important and large city, and 1/3 of the population was Jewish. It held one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe, second only to Warsaw. Lodz was the textile city where cloth and things made from cloth were made. My father's family was in the leather tanning business, where they treated skins and hides of animals to produce leather. My mother's father, my grandfather, was a textile merchant. I always have trouble referring to my parents' parents as grandparents. But more importantly, he was a Torah scholar, and at one point was offered the position of chief rabbi of Scotland. Very unusual for that time and place, my grandmother, played piano and spoke French. Both my parents came from Hasidic families and were very religious. This meant they observed the Sabbath and all the Jewish holidays. They observed all the Jewish dietary laws. It also meant they had a distinct form of dress and were very conspicuous. When my kids were younger, one of them asked my mother why she's no longer Hasidish. And even though my mother was very proud Jew and a Zionist, she said she never wanted to look that Jewish again. Both my parents went to religious schools. They both lived with their families in apartments that had electricity and indoor plumbing. Neither family was rich, but they were not poor either. Their early lives were uneventful. They studied and played just like youngsters everywhere. Their lives were turned upside down in 1939 when Hitler invented Poland. In early 1940, Jews were forced into moving into a ghetto in Lodz. The museum has a ghetto area and has a model of the Lodz Ghetto. A ghetto was a section of a city in which all Jews were required to live. The Nazis wanted Jews concentrated in ghettos, so when they found the solution to the Jewish problem, whether it be emigration or genocide, it could easily be carried out. Also, enclosing the Jews made it relatively easy to extract the quote unquote hidden treasures that Nazis believed Jews were hiding. The Nazis isolated the ghetto from the rest of Lodz with barbed wire fencing. Lippmanstadt was the name the Germans gave to the now quote unquote now German Lodz. Lodz had been a key industrial city in pre-war Poland. The Lodz Ghetto thus became a major production center under the German occupation. As early as May 1940, the Germans established factories in the ghetto and used Jewish residents for forced labor. By August 1942, there were almost 100 factories within the ghetto. The major factories produced textiles, especially uniforms, for the German army. Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski, chairman of the Jewish Council in the Lodz Ghetto, hoped to prevent the destruction of the ghetto by making it as productive as possible. He gambled that Jewish labor essential to German factories would spare Jews from eventual deportation and preserve the Lodz Ghetto until the end of the war. My parents always talked about Rumkowski and whether what he did was right. Overcrowding in the ghetto was exacerbated by the influx of some 40,000 Polish Jews forced out from the surrounding areas, as well as by the Holocaust transports of foreign Jews resettled to Lodz from Vienna, Berlin, Cologne, Hamburg, and other places. Living conditions in the Lodz Ghetto were extremely harsh. Very few people had access to running water, and there was no sewage system. The German authorities controlled the supply of food. Anyone found trying to supplement their rations by smuggling was in danger of death. My parents and their families were forced to live in tight, crowded conditions. My mother was 15 years old. Food was scarce, as was water and heating materials. Because of the dense living conditions, disease and lice spread quickly. My grandmother died in the ghetto of a heart-related ailment. She might have survived had living conditions been better and proper medication available. Next. 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 That is, go back to that. That is my mother's Lodz Ghetto ID card. This card and the two pictures of my father's sisters are the only artifacts that I have that are pre-liberation. And I thank my niece Sherry, who is also doing some family history. The researcher she's working with actually found this, this ID card. And the ID card says my mother was born in 1924. I've seen places of her date of birth was 1925 or 1923. So we're not exactly sure, but this is an amazing find. Everyone had to work in the ghetto and prove themselves useful. My mother told me how they dressed her baby sister in adult-type clothes to make her look like an adult and sat her in front of a sewing machine in one of the factories to make it look like she was working. My mother saw the need was great for nurses. She had no formal training as a nurse, but volunteered her services in the hospital and had on-the-job training. Because of its remarkable productivity, the ghetto managed to survive until August 1944. It was the last ghetto to be liquidated. That was when my mother, along with two of her sisters, was deported from the ghetto. Deportees were told they were being transferred to working camps in Germany. Next. My mother was sent to Auschwitz, where she thought she saw the notorious Dr. Mengele. Dr. Mengele was a physician who performed deadly experiments on some prisoners. As the boxcars were being unloaded, the Nazi guards referred to the deportees as apes. My mother arrived in Auschwitz with beautiful, thick blonde braids. The Nazis yelled at her, saying Jews were not allowed to have such beautiful hair, and they started pulling her hair out by the roots till her scalp bled. Then they shaved, next, what was left of her hair. Next. Next. Most of the Jews on the last deportations from Lodz were not tattooed, so neither of my parents had them. Even though Germans and Nazis were known for their efficiency, By the time many Lodz Ghetto deportees were sent to Auschwitz, the Nazis knew they were losing the war and were in somewhat disarray, and not everyone was tattooed. Only people who were deemed strong enough to work were tattooed, and Auschwitz was the only camp where people were tattooed. All prisoners were given ID numbers and were on their uniforms. They no longer had names, just numbers. Living conditions in Auschwitz were beyond horrific. Little food, warmth, clothes, or sanitary conditions. The inmates were slave laborers. My mom was lucky to have survived Auschwitz. If you notice, I'm wearing a hand-knit scarf. I knit this scarf. I come by this talent naturally. My mother taught me to knit. Knitting for my mother was not always a hobby. In Auschwitz, it was what saved her life. When prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, they were asked if they had any special skills. My mother was a knitter, so she was given the assignment to knit mittens for the Nazi guards. It also gave her better working conditions. She worked indoors. From Auschwitz, she was sent on a death march to Bergen-Belsen, from which she was eventually liberated. Death marches referred to the forcible movements of prisoners of Nazi Germany between Nazi camps on pain of death. The purpose was to remove evidence of crimes against humanity committed inside the camps and to prevent the liberation of German-held prisoners of war. Her father and 4 sisters were in the Lodz Ghetto till it was liquidated in September of 1944. Liquidation meant that when all the Jewish people were concentrated into the ghettos in Poland, the next thing the Nazis wanted was to get rid of them. But how? So they came up with the idea to move the people out of the ghettos by force, put the people on cattle trains by force, and burn the ghettos down, even if there were people hiding, and those people would have been burned alive. They were sent to Auschwitz. My mother's family was a close-knit family, and they refused to be separated when they got to Auschwitz. They were all sent to the gas chamber. My father was 21 years old when he was sent to the ghetto. He and his family were in the ghetto till it was liquidated. My father's family were tanners. Tanners was necessary for the Nazi war effort, and they worked till the liquidation of the ghetto. They too were sent to Auschwitz. He worked in the cement factory. Every night his friends had to remove his cement helmet. The work was brutal. He was sent on a death march and was in 3 other concentration camps till he got to Dachau and was liberated from there. Next. The American and British armies liberated both my parents. My mother was liberated from Bergen-Belsen. I was once called out on a Facebook to second generation community for saying that my mother was liberated by the Americans because the British Army mainly liberated Bergen-Belsen. That's what I heard from my mother. She talked about seeing an African-American GI on horseback. At a training session at the museum, I was sitting next to a fellow volunteer. We talked about our backgrounds. When I told her my mother was liberated from Bergen-Belsen, she said that it might have been her father who liberated my mother because the American army was there also. My father was very sick from near starvation conditions. He, like so many other survivors, got even more sick when the American GIs, out of kindness, threw candy bars to the survivors. My father's body was not yet ready to tolerate such rich food. He was in the hospital a few months and suffered from intestinal problems the rest of his life. So it is now 1944, and my mother has been liberated, as was my father. My mother was 20 years old, and my father was 26. What does it mean to be liberated? They are no longer slaves. Yes, in the middle of the 20th century, in the most civilized of all countries, they had been slaves. Just as American slaves were emancipated by Abraham Lincoln, my parents were liberated by the American and British armies. But they were alone, no parents or siblings. My mother had 3 uncles and an aunt who survived. My father was left with not one living relative. The best years of their lives were stolen from them. What to do now? Where should they go? Where could they go? They had no official papers, no home, no family. Neither wanted to go back to Lodz. Their belief in God and their strong will to live propelled them forward. They knew they wanted to start living again. They both ended up in a displaced persons, a DP camp in Germany by the name of Zalzheim, which was a suburb of the city of Frankfurt. It was administered by the Americans. The Zalzheim camp was not typical of other DP camps because it was not a former concentration camp or a former barracks, but it was a suburb where IG Farben, the chemical company that made the Zyklon B that was used in the gas chambers, that's where their employees were lived. It was housing specifically for the employees of IG Farben. The conditions were cramped initially, and initially there were communal kitchens, but later on everyone had their own little kitchen. A friend of mine referred to Zeilsheim as the Waldorf Astoria of DP camps. Streets and buildings were named after cities and kibbutzim in Palestine. There was a kindergarten, elementary school, high school, and a yeshiva. There was a theater, a jazz orchestra, and sports club. There was a cinema, a library, a synagogue, a mikveh, a ritual bath. There were 2 Yiddish newspapers. Next. These are more recent pictures of Zeilsheim, but that's what it looked like. Next. Many important personalities visited the camp, including the future Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Next. She is standing in front of the Zalzheim Memorial. Next. The memorial was dedicated in the spring of 1946. It reads, "In memory of our loved ones murdered during the Nazi regime." I was curious about the memorial. After all, Zalzheim as a DP camp was closed at the end of 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. All the Jews left. I asked the German intern that worked at the museum to help me find out what happened to the monument. She was excited to find an article about it in a German newspaper from January 2018. She included a photo. Next. So this is what the memorial looks like now. It still didn't answer my question, what happened to the original memorial, but it does say that apparently Zeilsheim, what must have been a prisoner of war camp at some point, but it also had up to 5,000 Jewish concentration camp prisoners, former Jewish concentration camp prisoners, and Jews awaiting repatriation or emigration that lived there. I asked the intern why there was an article so recently in the newspaper, and she said it was in the travel section. So apparently, when the article talked about that part of Germany, and if you were visiting that part of Germany, that was a tourist attraction you might want to see. Both my parents had made friends in the concentration camps. My mother had a friend, Anja. Next. That's a picture of my mother is on the left and her friend Anja is on the right in front of that same memorial. And my father had a friend, Shmuel. Anja and Shmuel were a couple. Anja wanted my mother to meet Gershon, my father. My mother was a little hesitant because both Anja and Shmuel were not that religiously observant. Anja said to my mother not to worry because Gershon, my father, prays every morning with his tefillin, his phylacteries, which are worn during morning services except on the Sabbath or holidays. That's all my mother needed to hear. As it turned out, my mother's grandmother and my father's mother had been longtime friends. In June of 1946, they married. Next. Look closely at this picture. It is so bittersweet. This should have been the happiest days of their lives. but they were celebrating without one member of their families. I was born in May of 1947. Next. Look how I am dressed. A little hot for June or July, but there were no grandparents or older people who could advise new parents. My parents always talked about Zalzheim, but never said where or what it was. The little I know about Zeilsheim and my parents' general wartime experience, I know through osmosis. My parents might not have told their children about too many of their experiences, but when they got together with their survivor friends, no matter what the occasion or what started the conversation, it always ended with talk of the ghetto, the war, or concentration camps. If I was present, I just listened. I knew it was not my place to ask questions. After my mother had passed away, I was talking to her uncle and my place of birth came up. I said I was born in Frankfurt. He said, no, you were born in Zalzheim, saying it was a suburb of Frankfurt, but he never mentioned it was a DP camp. Soon after, I went on an adult March of the Living to Poland. The March of the Living is an annual educational program which brings students from around the world to Poland, where they explore the remnants of the Holocaust. And that's me with my sisters on the March of the Living. Next. On Holocaust Memorial Day, thousands of participants marched silently from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, the largest Nazi concentration camp complex built during World War II. On the bus, I heard a man say that in 1947, he had his bar mitzvah in Zeilsheim. I went over to him and told him I was born there in 1947, and he told me it was a DP camp. My parents made many friends in Zeilzheim, some of whom remained lifelong friends. Everyone wanted to leave Zeilzheim either to the land of Israel or the United States, but it was no easy matter. They had no documents. Everyone was considered stateless, a displaced person, or refugee. It was only many years later that people like my parents were referred to as survivors, which sounds more heroic than refugee or DP. They had to be officially registered with the United Nations. They filled out many forms many times, next, indicating where they had been in the last 12 years. These are documents from the International Red Cross and the International Tracing Service that have each of my parents' history up to that point, the Lodz Ghetto and the concentration camps they were in. These are their, and there were certificates of their residence, their displaced registration. One of the forms issued by the Allied Expeditionary Forces upon entry to displaced persons camp or assembly center. On one side is basic personal information, the other side is health issues. They were finally given, next. They were finally given ID cards, as did I, even though I was an infant. These cards are the United Nations Displaced Refugee Identity Cards. Next. See, that's my card. While my family was waiting to leave Germany, my mother took care of me and my father found ways to bring in money. He, like many other survivors, started out by dealing in the black market, an underground economy. The Jewish American Joint Distribution Committee, a Jewish organization known by everyone as the Joint, distributed needed items to the survivors, and many, like my father, would resell them. When I was a child, my parents would talk about the Joint, and I thought they were talking about a nightclub, a hangout. What did I know? One of my favorite stories about Zeilzheim, I heard many, many years later. When my youngest son got married 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, my great uncle got an honor at the wedding, at the ceremony under the chuppah. And there was a couple that was invited on my daughter-in-law's side who recognized my uncle, went over to him and asked him what connection he has to the wedding. And he said, do you remember my niece, Pulcha? My mother was known as Pulcha. Do you remember my niece, Pulcha? This is her grandson. Well, this couple couldn't wait to find me after the ceremony, and they came over to me and they told me how fondly they remembered my mother and my parents. And they said how elegant my mother was, but what they remembered most, they said that I had the most beautiful baby carriage in all of Zalzheim because of the way my mother decorated it. And this story stayed with me for a long time, and it could have been just a cute little story about ribbons and bows, but it told me so much about my parents, the fact that they had little money, and even with little money, there was little to buy, but they somehow figured out how to decorate the baby carriage of their miracle baby. As all of us firstborn children of survivors, we were all considered miracles. Initially, my parents wanted to go to the land of Israel. Next. This form asked them if they wanted to return to their country of origin, and they replied no. And it asks why, and they said because no Jews were left. Where do you want to go? The land of Israel. My father had become somewhat successful and wanted to open a textile plant in Israel. He even bought machinery and sent it over. But in Israel, it was a time of austerity, very harsh economic conditions, and Israel was a socialist country then. That meant the government wanted to be a partner, a majority partner. That was when my parents changed their minds and decided to try to immigrate to America. The Displaced Persons Act of 1950 raised the ceiling for Jewish refugees from 205,000 to 341,000. The process of immigrating to the US was complicated. Many agencies were involved. I have a whole list, including Hayas and the Joint and Jewish Family Services, many organizations. While in Zalzheim, my father was befriended by Rabbi Bernard Heller, the director of Jewish Culture Restitution, an organization charged with the restoration of cultural property looted by the Nazis from Jewish families, institutions, and organizations. From headquarters in Frankfurt am Main, Rabbi Heller handled the distribution of more than 30,000 confiscated volumes, many of them rare and valuable. Next. Oh, never mind. Which the Nazis had assembled for use in anti-Semitic institutes they hoped to establish after their victory. Apparently, the Nazis had hidden a whole trove of these documents and books in Frankfurt, and that is why Dr. Heller was in Frankfurt. If any of you remember the movie Monuments Men, Jewish culture restitution was really a part of the Allied group from the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program that was given the task of finding and saving pieces of art and other culturally important items before the Nazis destroy or steal them during World War II. Rabbi Heller was very fond of my father and later my mother and me. They became close, and Rabbi Heller wrote many letters on behalf of my father, attesting to his good character, and became our sponsor. A sponsor means agreeing to be financially responsible for someone and proving to immigration officials that you can support that person. When we finally got to the US, we remained good friends with Rabbi Heller, so much so that the never married Rabbi Heller would spend every Passover with us. We left Zalzheim in 1945 and moved to another city, Wiesbaden, and then to Frankfurt. My father was very successful. Here are some photos of our lives. That is me with my mother. We went skiing. Next. That's just a picture of me. Next. My favorite picture of my parents. I call it their Hollywood glamour photo. And I think it's so interesting if you remember what the ID card look what my parents look like there and look at them just a few years later. Look what they look like. Our lives were so comfortable, and we even owned a car. Legend has it that the car had to be sold to pay for part of our passage to America. Either way, we came on the Queen Mary, a luxury liner. Yet even with this comfortable life, they knew they could not stay in Germany. They wanted to be able to send me to a Jewish school. At great cost in many ways, we left Germany in 1952 and came to Forest Hills, New York, along with many friends from Zalzheim. Next. 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 These are all duplicates of the papers. Next. This shows the different concentration camps they were at. Next. This is what Dr. Heller was involved with, getting all of these, looking through all of these crates of papers and manuscripts. Next. At almost 5 years old, next, I arrived in New York along with my father and pregnant mother. We came in April, and in September, I started kindergarten at PS 139. My mother said that by the time I started kindergarten, I spoke perfect English. That was a busy month, September. My sister Rachel was born, and at night, my father went to English school at the same PS 139. Next. That's when we were arriving. Next. That's his card that he's going to English school. In 1960, my sister Sarah was born. My father worked, like so many of his survivor friends, he worked in real estate, first managing rooming houses. Life was not as easy as it had been in Frankfurt. The American way of life was very different, and of course there was the language barrier. Like all survivors, my parents spoke a few languages. They spoke Yiddish and Polish and German. Then they learned English, and my father knew some Hebrew. My mother took care of the home. Like all survivors I knew, the house was immaculate. My sisters and I went to the Jewish school that my parents helped establish. But memories of my parents' Holocaust experiences never left them. I was way into adulthood before I realized that my parents never took showers, only baths. My parents had many nightmares. I don't remember hearing screams at night, but they said they had nightmares, especially about being chased by Nazis with vicious dogs. But my sisters and I went to school and on to college, had friends and went to summer camp. We eventually got married and had families of our own. Unfortunately, my father died in 1960 at the age of 50. My mother died in 1995. My sisters and I decided to honor the memory of my mother's sisters by putting their names on her gravestone, the only place their names appear. When I speak to school groups, I end my talk with this parable that I made up. When a Jewish couple gets married, it's traditional for the new bride to light 2 Sabbath candles every Friday night to usher in the Sabbath. For some families, it is customary to add an extra candle for every child born. That is the custom in my family. I think of my parents as the 2 candlesticks. And from those 2 candlesticks, next, came a living candelabra. That's me with my sisters. Next. That's my husband, Sid, and I. That's my grandchildren, my children and great-grandchildren, and my children and grandchildren. My sister, Rachel. Next. Those are her children, her daughter, Sherry, who helped me get the ID card. Actually, there's now a little girl there in that family too. That's their son. Next. That's their son, Ari, with their 2 children. Next. That's my sister, Sarah, and her family. Next. And that's all of us. So thank you again for tuning in. Join us here next Wednesday, September 23rd at 10 o'clock to hear Holocaust survivor George Brent share his stories. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for sharing, Faye. We do have a couple right now. Let me pull them up real quick. One of the questions that I had, you mentioned your niece and the work she's doing. Can you talk a little bit more about what she's found in her research and kind of how that's going?
She hasn't found out much more than I've already known, but she would have sent me more stuff if she found out more. But we're going to be talking about it some more. I'm going to find out if there's because I initially sent her all the information I had, and then she's working with a researcher, and the researcher was using that material. Plus, she has the ability. She has sources that are available to her that aren't available to most just a plain person like me.
How did you get involved with the museum?
I started as a volunteer, and then I also belonged to a group from the U.S. Holocaust Museum. They have an office here, and it was Daughters of the Holocaust, and we would meet around once a month. And then I got an email, because I was a part of the Daughters of the Holocaust, that there was a researcher from the U.S. Holocaust Museum that would be happy to do some family research. So I went to meet with she was going to be in Chicago for 2 days, one day downtown, one day in the Highland Park office. So I went to meet with her, and she needed to know my parents, their names, their date of birth, and their place of birth. And that can be tricky too, because even names, spellings, well, I don't even think it took 2 or 3 minutes where her computer was connected to her computer in DC. It took probably 2 minutes, and she pulled up a whole file of my parents. All of this that she pulled up was post-Holocaust, but it was stuff that I didn't know. And I approached Amanda Friedemann from the education department, and I told her, I had just become a docent, and I told her I got all this information, I'd be happy to talk about it. So she said my timing was perfect, because they were doing workshop for second generation to be speakers, because unfortunately the survivors, who we all prefer to hear, there are fewer of them. Some of them are older and sick. So second generation is speaking. So I got in that's when I started speaking. And then I also decided I'll call HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and see if they have my parents' file. And sure enough, they sent me the entire file. And the International Tracing Service was free. I had to pay for the information from HIAS, but it was a trove of information. Also stuff that I didn't know, the telegram of our arrival, all of that was through HIAS.
It's amazing. It's really amazing how much more you continue to learn about. One more question that we've got is, what message do you want people to take away from hearing your family's story?
That there was, in fact, a Holocaust, because today we have so many deniers, and that there was, in fact, a Holocaust. Also, one more thing I wanted to say about research. I started, when we were talking about Rabbi Heller, I knew only because I started doing research that he was involved in this restitution organization. And last night I did some research, and I found a radio play about the research that was done. And that's where I found out that the reason everybody was in Frankfurt is because that's where the Nazis had hidden their trove. And the people that were portrayed in the radio play, one of them I knew really, really well. He was a good friend of my mother. And he was actually, for the Chicagoans among us, he was a brother-in-law to Rabbi Ben Kaganoff. His name was Shalom Pomerantz. So that's just a local tie-in.
That's so cool. We've
Yeah.
just got another question. Heidi has asked, when you started going to school in the States, were you placed with other former displaced kids? And did you talk about your family's experience with other kids?
That's a great question. I went to a Jewish school, and a number of us were children of survivors, and that usually meant we were the oldest. We knew that our parents were survivors, but remember, the term survivor was not used then. And I remember that when we talked about our parents, we referred to them as Europeans, and that's why they did things differently. Not because they were survivors or went through the war. They did things differently because they were European.
Interesting. I think that is all the questions we have right now. So I will let you say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you again. And when you feel comfortable, absolutely visit the museum.